I'm Samantha Black, Editor-in-Chief of ScienceBoard, and I'm here at SLAS 2022 with keynote speaker Raven Solomon, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader. Thanks for joining us, Raven.
Yeah, so today we talked about the clear business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, specifically in the life sciences. And quite frankly, what I usually talk about is the macro level of this business case, because it's relevant to every industry, every single industry, whether you are selling an object, you're providing a service, you're providing some sort of, lab experiment or lab science, etc. You have to be concerned with this topic, this subject matter, just as much as the person, selling widgets on down the street. So it impacts everyone. And so I talked a lot about the generational case for this work, the fact that Gen Z is about to infiltrate the workforce, every workforce across the world, really. They are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we've seen in the United States. They are the most gender diverse generation we've seen in the United States. And they have buying power, and they are massive. So they are also the largest living generation in the United States. And so I think it behooves every business owner, every manager, every leader, everyone selling a product or a service to really understand what it is this generation is looking for. And a big part of that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if we're not thinking about it, we're already behind.
Yeah, I love that. And you had some great panelists come up and have a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them working in the life science, all of them working in the life sciences.
Yeah.
So what were their contributions and tying it back to life sciences? I don't really think it's that different than other conversations that you would have in another industry. Yeah. I think that was maybe what was most shocking to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to me too, right? I get to have these conversations amidst every industry. After I leave here, I'm going to talk to literally farmers in Arizona. And so the conversation is going to be pretty much the same. It matters to every organization and every industry in the same way. The nuances are a little bit different. And so the panel came up and really talked about the micro level business case for this work. So why this matters specifically in life sciences. And so we kind of ran the gamut, right, in terms of profession, from laboratory scientists to those who manage business that supports the sciences, those who lead initiatives on a college campus. And then we also had a Gen Zer / millennial who gave us that real life perspective as to what it is she wanted in a role and why she chose to do what she does. So she's a dancer and she's also a scientist. And so the reality is that's what you're going to get a lot of the times with Gen Z, is you're going to get this hodgepodge of diversity, of creativity. And if we're smart, we figure out how we attract that, how we develop that, and how we retain that. My philosophy around diversity, equity, and inclusion work really comes through a lens of generational diversity first, because I just personally believe, and the data says this as well, that really the most complex of problems are solved when we have generational diversity present. And so when we think about inequity and exclusion, those are very big, complex problems. And I just so happen to believe that if we want to solve that, we need to have generational diversity present. And through that, as we talk about how diverse Gen Z is, how different millennials think, and how diverse they are as well, when we have generational diversity, we inherently begin to have more ethnic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, diversity in ability and educational level, and so many other things. So I really approach this work through the lens of generational diversity first. And then I also just really believe strongly in individual responsibility and accountability as it relates to creating inclusion. And so I do a lot of work with leaders of organizations, but I'm actually working on a book right now to help the everyday individual, whether you lead people or not, learn the necessary behaviors and traits to create inclusion around us, right? Because the fact of the matter is everywhere we go, we're bumping into people, and those people are encountering either our exclusive behavior or our inclusive behavior. And so this book is really about helping folks make sure that the circles they create around them are actually inclusive rather than exclusive. One of our panelists said very poignantly that inclusion starts with I, and it's true. It really does start with you and I, and we often think it starts with the president of the United States, or we think it starts with the leader of our organization, the CEO, the president. And in a facet, it absolutely does. But it also starts with you and I, and it's also our responsibility to make sure that we're doing and taking the necessary steps to learn, to educate ourselves, to change, to grow, so that we're not being the perpetuator of harm as we walk throughout our lives, right? And so it's a journey. But I think we began that journey today.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can go to ravensolomon.com. No, in all seriousness, I think that is the first step, is to really engage someone. It doesn't have to be me, of course, but to engage someone who does work in the space to help facilitate that. Because what I saw a lot in 2020 was a desire to do something, right? After the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, the nation turned its attention to the experience of Black people in America, right? In fact, the world did. And so with that came a desire that many had never seen to really do something about this issue. And so what happened is a lot of organizations just began holding conversations and began bringing in speakers and began trying to embark upon DE&I education. Some folks went the strategy route. So there were a lot of just different things people just wanted to do. And so we, especially here in America, have a very strong bias towards action. And so our bias told us the thing we should do is to just do. But what we really need to do is take a step back to engage the right folks, to understand where our organization is today, to kind of do a diagnostics run, right? I'm sure our audience of scientists can understand that. Yeah. You've got to understand where you are in order to then develop a plan strategically and otherwise to figure out where you want to be and then execute the steps necessary to get there. So it really does start with understanding where you are. So you need a professional to help you diagnose that, because oftentimes we think we are in a much better place than we are, right? And we make decisions based on our intentions and not necessarily based on where our organization is and the impact that our behavior has on those that we serve and those that we employ every day. And so it's important to take a step back, not have the knee-jerk reaction to do, but to actually pull back, to think, to listen, and then to create a plan that tells you what to do. So the plan absolutely is going to differ across organizations, it's going to differ across industry. You know, it's like you're having a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant come in and write a prescription for the ailments of that particular organization. And so there could be 5 ailments that they need to treat, if you will. There could be 10. In some organizations, they're 1, right? Because they've been doing the work for a while now. And so, what we see is this kind of continuum of, we start with, most of the time, compliance. There is this need to have our leaders really lead the charge in terms of the work. So we start with training leaders for the most part, and also developing communities in which shared experiences can live and folks can be supported and undergirded and supported. Well, I said supported, undergirded, to really do, I would say to thrive in that organization, but then they're equipped and empowered to actually be the catalyst of change and transformation in that organization. So those groups we typically call business resource groups or employee resource groups. Sometimes they're called affinity groups, right? So that's usually an early step that organizations take to not just create community, but also to create these groups by which accountability, is established, and also strategy is kind of guided. So that's one place to start: training leaders, developing ERGs, developing also a diversity, equity, and inclusion council or task force whose job is to pretty much develop the strategy for the organization with the help of diversity, equity, inclusion professionals, whether they work in the organization or are consultants. And so those are the places that folks tend to start. Again, that plan, though, needs to really be curated for your particular organization and also your industry. So a strategic plan we would write in education might be very different than a strategic plan we would write in consumer packaged goods, right? Because our end consumer is different. They have different needs. The makeup of our organization is also different. What our employees do is vastly different. And so there's no one size fits all by any means, but there are consistent places that one can start. And the last thing I would say is it's important that whatever plan you have, that there are points of metrics within that, right? Because what we know, at least in the business world, is that what gets measured gets done. And so a lot of folks just want to create plans, but those plans aren't smart, right? They aren't specific, they aren't measurable, they aren't actionable, relevant, time-bound, et cetera. So those plans have to be smart, and they have to be measured, and we have to have systems of accountability. There are so many studies upon studies upon studies that have been done to speak to that very thing. I mean, we see profitability increase within organizations. We see collaboration increase, decision-making quality increases. We see innovation increase, risk decrease. I mean, there's so many different facets of the business that are impacted by diversity and by inclusion, right? So it's so critical that we make sure we tack on that inclusion part, because as I talked about in the keynote, it's very easy for us to have diversity these days. But what's harder, and what's always been harder, is for us to have inclusion, where that difference that's present in our organization is actually engaged, actually utilized and leveraged to drive organizational results. And so when we have them both is when we see the types of results that I just mentioned a moment ago. But it's not going to come just by having diversity. It's not that easy. I wish it were, but it's just not that easy. When it comes to diversity, which we talked about in the keynote, right? Diversity is very quantitative. It's measurable. It is very measurable, I should say. It is about representation. It's about the counting of people. And so to your point, to the point of your question, that's why it's important and critical that we measure diversity. So a lot of folks are contrarians to the idea of counting heads and counting representation, but how else will we know if we are improving and if we're moving the needle in representation if we don't count? Right? So I think that's the first thing. Then you've got to figure out how you measure inclusion. And so inclusion is a lot harder to measure, but a lot of it is qualitative experience. And so it is about having a basis for where the organization is today. So you can gather that from a lot of different avenues. You could do employee engagement surveys. You could do focus groups. You could do interviews with leadership to really assess where what's the pulse of the organization, right, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then you execute your strategy over the course of a year. You provide training and you upskill leaders in terms of their inclusive leadership capability. And you help the everyday employee through trainings like mine just really understand how to show up differently and to be inclusive, to change their behavior, to create those circles of inclusion. So you make these investments, right? And then you measure again in that same way. You do focus groups, you do qualitative interviews with leaders, you field assessments, engagement surveys, et cetera. And you look at the delta, right? It's not rocket science. It is just that simple. And so what we have to be willing to do, though, is to do the work and to provide the resources to the folks doing the work to actually measure, hold folks accountable, and create transformation. Yeah, I'm particularly excited about that book I mentioned to you. I think it really, really is going to help people just think differently about how they engage with their coworkers, their colleagues, the people that they work with, but also how they engage throughout their everyday lives, in their communities, in society, at the movie theater, at their place of worship, et cetera. And so I'm really, really excited about that book because I do think that it's actually going to help create change at an individual level, which I think is critical. And then I'm excited about, possibly doing a course along with that to help accelerate learning and help people go deeper. And I'm just excited to continue to travel from organization to organization, helping them get future ready by understanding generations, racial equity, inclusion at all levels of the organization. So I'm here and at the disposal of all of your clientele and readers and listeners and viewers to do so.